All right, let's start. So, a brief recap to what we were doing, and then I'm going to link it up to the topic that we have to do today. So, as you know, we have been discussing what is encryption. All right, quickly going over what encryption is. Well, encryption is a method of converting data into a form in which it becomes meaningless. Converting the data, changing the data, scrambling the data into a form in which it would become meaningless. And what is the purpose of encryption? To make sure that if your data gets into wrong hands as a result of hacking, or somebody gains access to your data without your permission illegally, if the data is encrypted, the person will not be able to make up what the data is or understand what the data is. And when the person is not able to understand what the data is, they will not be able to misuse it. And hence, all the negative consequences that may arise due to somebody getting hold of your data illegally and misusing it can be negated. You can save yourself from that if your data is encrypted. So we discussed it in detail, but this was just a recap so that it sort of gets refreshed in your mind. In the last class, I told you that there are two main types of encryption that we will be studying later on. One of them is symmetric encryption. So we have symmetric encryption and we have asymmetric encryption. Now, what is the difference between the two? Okay, it says symmetric encryption is the oldest method of encryption. It requires both the sender and the recipient to possess a secret encryption and decryption key, known as a private key. What is this key all about? Key is basically, I would say, something that provides you access to the algorithm that has been used to encrypt data, and the same algorithm that will be used to decrypt the data. It has a key associated with it. Only and only if you know the key, you can say that you have the algorithm to encrypt or decrypt the data. Now, when it comes to symmetric encryption would mean that both the sender as well as the recipient will have the same key, which is known as a private key. It's a private key because it is only known to the sender and the recipient. So when a message is encrypted using a specific algorithm that has a certain private key, and that message is sent to the recipient, since the recipient has the same private key to the algorithm that has been used to encrypt the message, he will use the same private key to run the algorithm that will decrypt the message. The message will be brought back into its original form, and now the person or the recipient of that message can read through it and can use it for whatever purpose that message has been sent to them. So this is, in simple words, this is what symmetric encryption is. The important things to remember when it comes to symmetric encryption is that in symmetric encryption, both the sender and the recipient use the same key to encrypt and decrypt the message. That's one thing. And symmetric encryption is also known as private key encryption. These are the two things that you need to remember about it. Okay, let me also refer to my notes. Some things that I was going over in my notes, I thought probably I would show you. Yeah. This figure, I think, very accurately demonstrate the encryption process. So if you look at it, it begins with, at this stage, it begins with plain text. It begins with plain text at this stage. Yeah. The plain text will go through a process of encryption using the encryption algorithm, okay, or using the encryption key. This plain text or this plain message is encrypted. Once it has been converted into encrypted text or ciphertext, it is transferred over the network, the global network, which in this case is the internet. And then it reaches the recipient, where the recipient is going to use the same algorithm and using his decryption key to decrypt the algorithm. So if this is step 1, this is step 2. Okay, step 3 is where it gets transferred over the network. Step 4, where it arrives at the destination, and the recipient, using his private key, the same algorithm, uses it to decrypt the message and gets converted back to the plain text, और इसकी ये वही original form है जो ये थी, this. ठीक है? This is one and the same thing. So eventually you're converting this to this, but in between it goes through all this process. Yeah, and remember I told you one thing, that data is at its most vulnerable when it is actually being transmitted over the network. When it is stored locally, not really connected to any network, the chances of people accessing your computer or your data, getting hold of it and misusing it are not as much as they are when the data is in the transmission phase. All right, so this is also something that you must keep in your mind. All right, I was telling you in our last lecture that that Caesar cipher that we looked at was one of the very first simple ways of ciphering or encrypting data. But at that time, it had an impact of its own, because it was something new. Nobody knew about it. And then whatever method Caesar cipher uses, that that plus shift method, where it is a case of +3 shift or +2 or +4 or whatever. So the standard can change every time. If somebody doesn't know about it, it would be very difficult for them to figure out what the data is, okay, and as to how the data has been converted into this form. But gone are the days when that kind of an encryption was used. Today, modern computers make use of very hi-fi, very complex algorithms to encrypt and decrypt the data. And they say that these algorithms are always next to crack. I mean, it is impossible to really guess them or to crack them. So if you look at this, it says modern encryption uses 256-bit keys, which makes this form of encryption virtually impossible to crack. In other words, computer science students would understand this better, what is meant by 256-bit, but I'll try to briefly touch upon it. 256-bit would mean that 256 bits have been used to form the combination that you would be using to represent data. The greater the number of bits, or the greater the group of bits that you can use to represent a data, the more are the combinations that you can create. If I have 256 bits, 256 zeros and ones, we do know that zeros and ones is what binary language or machine language is all about. And this is the form in which the computer deals with every data. Each and everything that goes inside a computer through an input device gets stored on a storage medium and then is output onto an output device is in the form of ones and zeros. Computer doesn't know anything else. ये A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, @ comma, speech marks, picture, audio, video, animation, we know what these are. For computer, at the end of the day, it is all data, and it is all ones and zeros, nothing else. So my point is that if the computer uses 200 and a combination of 256 ones and zeros to represent something, imagine how many different combinations of ones and zeros you will be able to make to represent information. It is a lot. Hence, the greater the number of bits being used to encrypt or to represent encrypted data, the more difficult would it be to guess it or to crack it as to what it is. And by the way, this 256-bit encryption is an upgrade on 128-bit encryption. Yeah, 64-bit, 128-bit to 256-bit encryption. So as you could see, the more the number of bits, the more the combinations, the more complex it becomes to really understand as to what method has been used to encrypt the data. Yeah, so this 256-bit key encryption is very, very difficult to crack. Okay, moving on to, I'm going to switch back to the book. The next is asymmetric encryption. Okay, so when we say symmetric, asymmetric would mean opposite. जो हम एक ही टर्म यूज करते हैं यूजुअली, जैसे political, apolitical. If we say somebody is political, if we say somebody is not political, we can also say apolitical. I can say, okay, he is apolitical. I would mean that he is not into politics or he is not political. So symmetric, asymmetric. So whatever way in which symmetric encryption works, asymmetric works opposite to that. And how is it opposite to it? Well, let's see. So if you look at it, it says asymmetric encryption is also known as public key cryptography or public key encryption. Symmetric encryption is also known as private key encryption, whereas asymmetric encryption is also known as public key encryption or cryptography. Okay, asymmetric encryption overcomes the problem of, okay, so this is an important point. Asymmetric encryption overcomes the problem of symmetric encryption where keys can be intercepted by using a pair of keys. Okay, now I'll have to go back a bit so that I can explain this point to you. I think somebody in the class in the previous lesson, either I think in this campus or at the Ring Road campus, raised this question that, yeah, while I was teaching this, some student raised a query that what if the encryption key also goes to the hacker? Is there a chance of that happening? How? पहले तो ये डिसाइड कर लेते हैं कि is there a chance of, along with the encrypted message itself, is there a chance of the encryption key and along with that the algorithm that has been used to encrypt the message, can that also fall in the hands of the hacker? The answer is, in case of symmetric encryption, yes. Because this is where symmetric encryption is less secure compared to asymmetric encryption. And why do I say that? Well, with symmetric encryption, what happens is that when the sender encrypts the message to be sent to the recipient, whatever algorithm he has used and the associated encryption key will also have to be transferred or sent to the recipient. The recipient doesn't have it. I have encrypted it. I know how I have encrypted it. And for it to be understood by the recipient, until unless I share the decryption key or the algorithm with the recipient, the person would not be able to decrypt the message. So there are two ways in which I can share that decryption key, or for that matter, the encryption key. One is that I send the encryption key or the decryption key along with the message itself. That would be very silly to do, because if the message was to go into wrong hands, the decryption key would also go to the hacker, and then of course he can use it to decrypt the message. Or else it could be a case of first sending the message and then at a later time sending the decryption key. But the problem here is this, that in both the cases, the data is being transferred over the network from point A to point B, or from the sender to the recipient. Hence, if it is to be hacked and if it is to be illegally accessed, it can happen. The point is this, that the possibility is there. That is what makes symmetric encryption less secure. And this is what this point here means. It says asymmetric encryption overcomes the problem of symmetric encryption, keys being intercepted and then used. And how does asymmetric encryption stop that? That is what we are going to understand next. And for that, I'm going to refer back to my notes. So this is how the encryption process works. So you can have a look at this. I showed you another diagram as well that depicts the process of encryption. Okay, the asymmetric process. How does it work? So we can have a look at this example of Jane and Tom, having to share some data with each other, making use of asymmetric encryption. How would it work? So step by step, looking at step number 1. In asymmetric encryption, what happens? Jane uses an algorithm to generate a matching pair of keys, private and public, that they must keep stored on their computers. The matching pairs of keys are mathematically linked but can't be derived from each other. Don't really have to get into the technical details of this, but what we can say is that there are two keys being made. One is the public key, which is meant for both the sender and the recipient. The public key that Jane is making is meant for Jane as well as Tom, the sender as well as the recipient. But the private key, which has been derived from the same public key or the same algorithm using some sort of a mathematical method, okay? What I mean to say is that whatever private key is being calculated or being formulated using a certain mathematical method is only applicable on that particular public key and algorithm. That is how it is mathematically linked. Yeah. The private key that Jane creates using the public key only resides with or only remains with Jane. That Jane is not sharing. Jane has to share the public key so that Tom can use the same key to encrypt the message. Jane knows what that public key is. So when Tom sends that message back to Jane, okay, Jane will not use the public key to decrypt it. She will use that mathematically calculated private key that is only with her to decrypt the message. Process को step by step देखते हैं. Let's have a look at it. Now, so after having created the public key, Jane shares it with Tom. Jane says, Tom, please use this key to encrypt the message. Jane will tell Tom, this is the key that I have, public key that I have created. Please use this key to encrypt the message. So Jane has already created this public key and has also derived that private key from it. अब आप देखो कि जो पब्लिक की है वो जेन के पास भी है और टॉम के पास भी है, but the private key only is with Jane. What's next? Tom now uses Jane's public key to encrypt the document he wishes to send to her. He then sends his encrypted document ciphertext back to Jane. So Tom uses the public key shared by Jane, encrypts the message, sends the message to Jane in encrypted form. Yeah, Jane already knows what the method is that has been used to encrypt the message. Step number 4. By the way, I did not put a tick. So we're done with this step. We've seen what is happening at this step. And the last step, step number 4. Jane now uses her matching private key to unlock Tom's document and decrypt it. This works because the public key used to encrypt the document and the public key to encrypt the document and the private key used to decrypt it are a matching pair generated on Jane's computer. Yeah. So, how is asymmetric encryption different from symmetric encryption? Very quickly, symmetric encryption is not as secure as asymmetric because it only generates one pair of keys, which is known to the sender as well as the recipient, and the fact that the encryption and the decryption key is also to be shared with the recipient, so when the message has been encrypted by the sender, so that when the message arrives the recipient can decrypt it. And it is at that point that there are chances of, along with the message, the encryption decryption key also falling in the hands of the hacker, and hence he misusing it or maybe using it to decrypt the message. That is not the case in asymmetric encryption. There are two pairs of keys created. There's a public key that is known to both the sender and the recipient. The sender generates the public key and a matching private key through some mathematically calculated model. Shares the public key with the sender so that sender can use that key to encrypt the message, which the recipient already knows. When, after having encrypted the message, it is sent to the sender, okay, it is sent to the recipient, actually I should say, the recipient would use his or her private key to decrypt the message. So in this case, since the private key stays stored on the recipient's computer, it is never shared. Of course, there are no chances of that private key going in wrong hands, and hence, making the whole data vulnerable. All right. So this is what the main difference is between symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Any confusion, anyone? If you do, well, you can ask your questions, of course. But it is important that the concept is clear. No questions? No one? Okay, all right. That's great.